19th November 1935, Talk 97. One Mr. Ram Chandar, a gentleman from Ambala, asked where the heart is and what realization is. Maharishi, the heart is not physical, it is spiritual. Hridayam, Hrit plus Ayam. This is the center. It is that from which thoughts arise, on which they subsist, and where they are resolved. The thoughts are the content of the mind, and they shape the universe. The heart is the center of all. Yatova imani bhutani jayante, that from which these beings come into existence, etc., is said to be Brahman in the Upanishad. That is the heart, Brahman is the heart. Devotee, how to realize the heart, Maharishi? There is no one who, even for a trice, fails to experience the self. For no one admits that he ever stands apart from the self. He is the self is the heart. Devotee, it is not clear, Maharishi. In deep sleep you exist, awake you remain. The same self is in both states. The difference is only in the awareness and the non-awareness of the world. The world rises with the mind and sets with the mind. That which rises and sets is not the self. The self is different, giving rise to the mind, sustaining it and resolving it. So the self is the underlying principle. When asked who you are, you place your hand on the right side of the breast and say, I am. There you involuntarily point out the self. The self is thus known. But the individual is miserable because he confounds the mind and the body with the self. Thus confusion is due to wrong knowledge. Elimination of wrong knowledge is alone needed. Such elimination results in realization. Devotee, how to control the mind? Maharishi, what is mind? Whose is the mind? Devotee, mind always wanders. I cannot control it. Maharishi, it is the nature of the mind to wander. You are not the mind. The mind springs up and sinks down. It is impermanent, transitory, whereas you are eternal. There is nothing but the self. To inhere in the self is the thing. Never mind the mind. If its source is sought, it will vanish, leaving the self unaffected. Devotee, so one need not seek to control the mind. Maharishi, there is no mind to control if you realize the self. The mind vanishing, the self shines forth. In the realized man, the mind may be active or inactive. The self alone remains for him. For the mind, the body, and the world are not separate from the self. They rise from and sink into the self. They do not remain apart from the self. Can they be different from the self? Only be aware of the self. Why worry about these shadows? How do they affect the self? Talk 98. Bhagwan further explained, the self is the heart. The heart is self-luminous. Light arises from the heart and reaches the brain, which is the seat of the mind. The world is seen with the mind, that is by the reflected light of the self. It is perceived with the aid of the mind. When the mind is illumined, it is aware of the world. When it is not itself so illumined, it is not aware of the world. If the mind is turned in towards the source of light, objective knowledge ceases and the self alone shines forth as the heart. The moon shines by the reflected light of the sun. When the sun has set, the moon is useful for revealing objects. When the sun has risen, no one needs the moon, although the pale disk of the moon is visible in the sky. So it is with the mind and the heart. The mind is useful because of its reflected light. It is used for seeing objects. When it is turned inwards, the source of illumination shines forth by itself, and the mind remains dim and useless like the moon in daytime. Talk 99.